everyone. Thanks for joining Game Trade Media at Alliance Open House. I'm Gretchen, and I'm here with Pat from the Op.
Hi, how's it going?
Going pretty good. What do you have here?
We have Court of the Dead Mourners Call. So this is, I would argue, our heaviest strategy game that we've done at the Op. It's a big box minis game, lots of cool sculpted pieces, and this is a partnership we did with Sideshow Collectibles.
Let's take a look at everything you have here because there's so much and it all looks so cool.
Yeah, one of the advantages of working with Sideshow is, they are known for selling premium format, large figures for different IPs, different licenses, and this is their own original IP that they created, the Court of the Dead, and because they're known for their art and their sculpture, the art that they provided us to work with on this game is just phenomenal. So the box art, the board art, the card art, just above and beyond what you see a lot in the game space because they just had such deep asset pools to work with and weren't afraid to do some custom stuff. So that's usually where I jump in is like even this board is all custom art that was done for the game and just very, very detailed, giant 24 by 36 board. And I know not everybody watching is going to know what's Court of the Dead, right? So I like to give people a little story primer of what this all is and where it comes from. So Court of the Dead is a graphic novel series, and there's figure collectibles that Sideshow does because that's what they do best. And they're working on a bunch of other content, including a novel trilogy that's going to tell the big story of this universe. And so the creator, Tom Gilliland, is also a gamer, and he plays miniatures games, and so it was very important to him to have a game that told the story of the world he created. We were lucky enough to be able to design that for him. And in this story arc, it's sort of a reimagining of what happens after we die, right? Where do we go, and what is it all about? And in this story arc, like many of those story arcs, heaven and hell are at war. But what's happened is they've been at war so long, they've lost all sight of good versus evil. It's just all they care about is destroying one another. And the way that they fuel their war is with etheria, which is sort of a human soul energy. And in order to get that energy, they create death and the Mortis Knights in the underworld, and they task them with coming into our realm and harvesting that energy.
All right.
Right? So it's kind of a bleak take on it, but what's really unique about this story is Death develops a conscience and no longer wants to do that because he sees it as a waste of this precious resource. And he realizes he can sort of create an afterlife experience in the underworld that's more fulfilling and more meaningful than just being burned off as fuel for a war. So that's where the players come in, and where the story happens in the game is, as players, we have recently died and entered the underworld. And upon arriving, we start to realize what's going on is that there is a secret movement here to build up forces for the eventual overthrow of heaven and hell. And it seems like, okay, great, we're all on the same team, right? We all want to do the same thing. But unfortunately, the underworld has fractioned into 3 factions. And those are bone, flesh, and spirit. And so you're going to see that theme throughout this game. You've got miniatures in the 3 colors. So there's 2 main sculpts here for the bone faction, and then 2 as well for spirit and flesh. And feel free to take a look at those guys. And each of these sculpts represents a guild that is part of that particular faction. And they're known for doing different things. So Bone faction has the Mortis Knights and the Council of Osteomancy. They're the rule enforcers and the producers, and they're very strict and rigid, as Bone implies. Spirit's a little more freeform, more creative, but they also have this sort of healing aspect, and they primarily deal with this corrosive, corruptive force known as the Dread Script that exists and tends to latch on to power-hungry or greedy characters in the story arc and corrupt them into monsters. And then Flesh is all about creation and change, and so their 2 guilds deal with basically creating new figures that you can get and assassinating figures that aren't contributing to the cause. So in this fractured universe where we have these 3 different things, each player is going to elect to play as one of the factions at the start of the game, and that's a secret choice based on some hidden objective cards you get. So we have these ulterior motives, and this is where yes, we're all here for the same cause, but we all have our own unique vision of how to achieve that cause, and we all want to be the hero when we eventually are ready to overthrow heaven and hell. And so each player will get a ulterior motive card from each of the 3 factions at the start of the game. So you've got the bone, flesh, and the spirit. And then in secret, you're going to choose one of those to play and put it face down. And when everybody's selected, we then use these tokens to reveal which faction we've chosen, but not which objective. And so this kind of kicks players off with an immediate, like, okay, here's a goal I have. So if you're learning the game for the first time, you have this opportunity to sort of say, oh, okay, well, I know as this flesh player, if I chose this one, that my unity points, which are usually 1 point apiece, are going to be doubled. So I'm going to lean into things that do that, right? And if nothing else, I know that's a strategy. On the flip side, if you've played this game a bunch and you see somebody reveal this flesh faction token, and then you see them start hoarding a lot of the unity, you start to realize that that's probably their strategy and look for ways to get in their way. And so you can kind of start to decipher different ways to play the game and to be competitive. So that's one of the things I really like is this tension between like, yeah, we're all here for this greater purpose, but I really have my own way that I want us to achieve that purpose, and so we're definitely playing a competitive game here. One of the other things that kind of fuels that too is there's 2 tracks on the board. You see Dreadscript Threat, and this, as I said, is that sort of internal corrupting force. If you're too selfish, too greedy, it can basically degrade you into what's called a raker, and that's these purplish monsters here.
Oh no.
Yeah. And so that there's parts of the story arc where it's, they're basically trying to fend off the dread script and keep this force from overthrowing and basically ruining all their plans. On the flip side, we have this Celestial Suspicion track. So obviously, we don't want Heaven and Hell to figure out what we're doing down here until we're actually ready to go to war with them.
Of course.
Yeah, so that would be bad for everyone. So a lot of the acts that you take in the game that build the collective power of the underworld, and usually through building your own personal power, will push that track up as well. The higher those 2 tracks get, the worse it is for everyone playing the game. So you can kind of be villainized for doing things that push these tracks up because it alerts everybody like, hey, you're doing stuff over there that's kind of selfish and probably getting a lot of points for it, but you're putting us all in danger. The flip side is you can push those tracks back down with certain actions, which can get you points, usually through Unity tokens, which kind of say, like, I'm being the good guy here, so I get a couple points for that, but, like, really I helped us all out. And the ways that you can kind of play and manipulate and negotiate with the other players to be like, well, I'm the good guy here, so, but if you're playing this objective that maybe doubles your Unity, if you play it right, you can look like, oh, I'm just helping everyone out, no big deal, but really come out way ahead of the other players.
Multi-layer strategies going on.
Yeah, and it's great to see people who know each other well in the testing play this game, because there's a lot of that like, oh, are you going to let her get away with that? And suddenly, like, you've got 2 players over here bickering, and you're just quietly amassing resources and doing things.
I can also imagine if you're playing with friends that their strategies, maybe they're, your core group of gamers that have played other similar-esque games, what they're going to go for. Like, their norm.
Yeah, for sure. Like, I tend to play Bone Faction because there's a great quiz on the Sideshow site you can take to figure out, like, what faction you align with. And I guess not surprisingly, as somebody who does game mechanics, like, I'm more in that, like, methodical, thinky Bone Faction space, right? And there's a certain objective I really like, which is if you collect a set of one of each color of figure, you get 7 points at the end of the game per set. The problem with doing that is if you're a Bone Faction player and suddenly you have a very colorful array of figures, which you're allowed to do, other players start to catch on. Like, that's weird. Usually somebody playing a particular faction tends to have more figures of their faction, but to have that, like, diverse pool kind of sends up a red flag, and so people in our group know that I tend to like that objective. And so what they'll do is they'll just very carefully pick off this one and this one, and now I have no sets left, So it's an interesting thing to see how that plays out, and people go after strengths. But then there are times when I'm not doing that one, that objective, but I can still collect a variety of figures to my advantage and set the trap of, like, sure, go after them, because that's not where my points come from.
There's so many minis that come with this if you are a mini person, if that is like something that you like in a game.
Yeah, so there's, in the retail version of the game, which is our 2 to 4 player version, there are 57 minis in this game, which for the price point, our MSRP is $99.95, so you get a ton of stuff in the game for just under $100. So
and these are all good sculpts. Like, they're so detailed. This is a hefty plastic too. This is
it's a pretty heavy, dense PVC, and we needed to do that, of course, to hold the detail. And even if you get in close on some of these figures, like the shield on the back of these Mortis Knight figures has like slash and battle marks in it and things like that to show, like, these guys have been to war before, and they're doing some some pretty heavy fighting there. I don't know if I can get the light right to catch that there's like these cuts across the shield there.
There we go.
It's always the challenge of trying to show mini detail on screen, but and then this guy's my favorite, the Council of Osteomancy. He's sort of they're the administrators and the bookkeepers of the underworld, and so he's got his great scroll and stack of books and all of that. So just a very cool aesthetic. And again, like this world and working with Sideshow, like what they were able to create in terms of the art and the sculpting, these big pieces as well. And it was really fun because our 3D team at the op got to do some of the digital sculpting for these pieces.
Awesome.
And they were having a blast with it because, we do a lot of different games. They do, they'll sculpt our Monopoly tokens and our Clue tokens. They'll do our chess pieces, which are usually extremely detailed. But this was like a different dark universe they hadn't played in before. And I know our 3D manager like dove into this full force and was having a great time with it. And we have these great images that Tom from Sideshow did to help us get the figure poses right. So there's like pictures of him doing basically all of these poses with like sketches drawn over the photographs. And for one of them, we were considering like, oh, maybe the Mortis Knights would be on a horse. And so there's this photo of him like straddling a bike rack in front of their office, like doing a majestic I'm riding a horse pose. And he's like, a person on a horse would look like this. And, as a reference. So
that's just a testament to how much love and care went into everything.
Yeah, for sure. And Tom, obviously is the creator of this universe. He knows lore that hasn't been revealed yet, and he knows where the story's going, and was able to give us subtle nods to that kind of stuff of like, have this character card lean this way in terms of what they do, which was really, really cool to have that kind of insight. And then, I talk a lot about the art. The court cards here, these are the main characters in this particular story. And you can see just the beautiful art that was done for each of these character cards. And there's 17 of them in this big tarot size. And these are drafted in one of the phases of the game. So players get to kind of pick and choose which of these they want. And what I really like, too, is that each card has two ways it can work. So after you've drafted the hand, when you get into the thick of play, you have this opportunity to say, like, well, I was going to do this action, but, that this track is now, all the way up here at 9. And if I do that, it's going to push it to 10, which is going to give me a bunch of consequences I don't want for maxing it out. So now I'm going to pivot and use the bottom half of the card to kind of change up and take a different approach. So there's a lot of variety, a lot of decision-making. But the flip side is turns are very short. So when it's a turn, you're going to do one thing, which might be put a character on the board, play a single card. It might be just getting a new figure by paying some resources. So even in a 4-player game, your turn comes back around very quickly. So there's not that downtime we see in big strategy games sometimes where it's like, oh, okay, well, I took my turn.
Guess I'll take a nap and take a sip of coffee and figure my stuff out. Well, how many rounds are there left till I come back around and be able to do the things?
Yeah, let me check social media, do the, yeah. So we've tried to keep that streamlined, and then the game has a built-in timer. So I talked about, this whole idea of we're trying to unify the underworld. And so the Unity tokens are our timer. When all of them have been collected by players, we know that like the underworld is ready for its purpose. And so that triggers like an endgame sequence that wraps up the play rather quickly. And that usually happens in the 3rd round of play. And what's nice about that is that usually takes it right about 90 minutes. So it's enough time to kind of explore your strategy, see some of the different cards, try some different things, and build up some points. But it's not so much time that like you kind of go through that and you're like, oh, I've got a good engine going, and now I'm just watching it do what it does and waiting.
So once all of that starts to go into to motion, what is the win condition?
Yeah, so when the end game is triggered, there's these great reference cards, and it shows you the phases of a round. When the Unity runs out, you're going to finish that round, and then you're going to score 3 ways. So the first way is your hidden objectives. So, for example, this player that we talked about before, where they're getting 2 points for each Unity, they're going to score extra there. Another player might have this one, for example, gain 4 points for each Bone Mourner card you collected. So that's these cards that do sort of a tableau or engine building effect. They each have their own ability, and as you recruit them, you get additional strengths. But they're also going to score 4 points for each of those that they get from the Bone faction. So they would score up 4 for each of those. And then on your player board, yes, there's more pieces. You have 3 tracks, and these are the influence you have within each of the factions. And so as play goes on, you're going to work your way up these tracks. And at the top of the player board are point ranges. And so, you start out in the 1-point range, you move up to 3, 6, 10, 13, and you can max out at 15 points per faction. But influence is a resource.
Mm-hmm.
So you have this balancing act of like, well, I got, the bone influence up to here, but I need to move 2 troops into a bone location. The way you do that is by spending influence of that type. So now I've just cost myself 3 points in order to get onto the board. So there's that balance of like, controlling a location is going to be really good, but is it going to be good for long enough to balance out the cost of points? But if it was endgame, you'd be adding your objective points to your points for each of these 3, and then 1 point per unity token. So 3 ways to score, 3 ways to kind of massage and strategize and kind of work through. I've seen people get blocked on their objective and be struggling with it, and then just find a way to ramp these tracks up pretty high and stay in the mix. Or people lean really heavily and successfully into their objective, maybe get a few unity tokens but not have as much influence. So there's different ways, and usually within that 90-minute window, you're not going to do exceptionally well in all 3 because it's too tight of a game.
Be focused.
Yeah, and that's where I struggle as a player because I like to explore. I'm like, I've never tried this approach before. I'm like, that approach didn't work because I got distracted halfway through and then pivoted to something else, and yeah.
So, remind me, did we say when this was available?
We did not yet. So this was initially a Kickstarter, and that's shipping this week from the distributor, and then the retail version is scheduled for November. And so what we're really hoping there for our retailers is that initial run is going to get out there, get a lot of play, get some buzz, and it's going to be unavailable to anyone else until it hits retail in November. So hopefully that'll create some momentum when this hits store shelves, that everybody who missed out on our Kickstarter is going to be watching those reviews and feedback from other players and kind of wondering where they're going to get it, and we're going to be directing them to local game stores.
Now's the time for them to go to their local game store and be like, hey, so I heard about this.
Exactly.
Get ready.
And we're doing, we're trying to get it out there now into distribution and letting people do some pre-order and stuff like that as much as we can. So we really are doing everything we can to get folks excited. And then, for the retailers, because it was a Kickstarter, the big advantage there is we've done a ton of video content. So we've done full playthroughs, how to plays, or story overviews. There's some animated stuff out there. So there's a lot of content that already exists that they can use to teach their customers the game or learn it for themselves, and watch like a full game played out from start to finish.
So where could they find content like that?
So you can find it through some of our social media channels at the op, and then through the Kickstarter page. A lot of those videos are still linked there. We did Game the Game, so there's a full playthrough video on Game the Game. So there's a lot of that out there. And then Sideshow's, they call it their Dead Stream for Court of the Dead. We've been on their show several times and done some content with them as well, just talking about some of the more detailed mechanics, but also, for people who want to dive deeper and see how the game is played without reading the rulebook, you can watch, and we do our best to kind of narrate turns on those videos. So not only, like, I'm not just moving a piece, I'm explaining how and why I'm doing it so that people can kind of pick up the strategy as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming out. Thank you for showing us this game and all of its beautiful, lovely pieces. They are amazing. And we will see you at your friendly local game store.